A new beginning with old shadows. The bell echoed through the wide hallways of Lincoln Heights High School, signaling the start of the day. The sound was a familiar one, yet today it seemed sharper, as though the walls themselves anticipated what was to come. Students poured into classrooms, their chatter blending into a soft hum. In room 314, Mrs. Cynthia Langston, the school's most senior English teacher, stood at her podium, surveying her domain. Mrs. Langston was known for her strict adherence to rules and her no-nonsense attitude. Her gaze, often as cold as the Arctic wind, was enough to silence even the rowdiest of students, while she prided herself on her commitment to discipline. Some whispered that her authority came from a place of prejudice, her judgments often harsher on students who didn't fit her ideal mold. Today, however, Mrs. Langston had something different to focus on. A new student had joined her class, a transfer from another district. The students whispered excitedly as the girl stepped through the doorway. Jada Anderson entered, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder. Her dark brown skin glowed in the morning light streaming through the windows, her neatly braided hair tied back with a purple ribbon. She was poised, confident, and unfazed by the sudden attention of her peers. Her presence alone seemed to charge the room with tension. Whispers rippled across the classroom like waves on a disturbed pond, drawing Mrs. Langston's eyes sharply toward the new arrival. "And you are?" Mrs. Langston's voice was sharp and cool, slicing through the murmurs. "Jada Anderson," the girl replied, her voice steady and polite. Mrs. Langston raised an eyebrow, her lips tightening ever so slightly. "Well, Miss Anderson, I hope you're ready for a rigorous course. We have no room for distractions here." Jada nodded without hesitation. "I understand, ma'am." The teacher's gaze lingered for a moment, then shifted away. "There's an empty seat in the back," she said, her tone dismissive. Jada made her way to her seat, ignoring the sidelong glances and hushed comments. She had grown used to this kind of reception. It was nothing new for her, especially as someone who had moved schools, often due to her father's career. What was new, however, was the peculiar sense of unease she felt here. It wasn't just the students, it was Mrs. Langston. The teacher's scrutiny was intense, almost dissecting. A class tense with unspoken words. The lesson began, focusing on To Kill a Mockingbird. Mrs. Langston wrote the title on the board in sharp, precise strokes, her voice carrying authority as she lectured about the historical context of the novel. "This book," she announced, "is a cornerstone of American literature. It examines themes of justice, morality, and courage in the face of societal prejudice." Jada's hand shot up, her eyes alight with interest. "Yes, Miss Anderson," Mrs. Langston said, her tone laced with a hint of challenge. "I believe the book also highlights the systemic nature of racism," Jada began. "It's not just about individual prejudice, but about how society enforces injustice through structures." "Systemic racism," Mrs. Langston interrupted, her lips curving into a thin smile. "Let's not insert modern political buzzwords into classic literature. Harper Lee wrote about a specific time and place. Perhaps you're projecting." A few students snickered, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Jada's face remained impassive, though her hands gripped the edge of her desk. "With all due respect," she said, keeping her voice calm, "the trial of Tom Robinson is a clear example of systemic racism. It's not about individual attitudes. It's about—" "That's enough," Mrs. Langston snapped, her smile vanishing. "Stick to the text, Miss Anderson. Interpretation is one thing, but overreach is another." The atmosphere in the room grew heavy. Jada leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable, but inside, she was burning. Not from embarrassment, but from frustration. Quiet defiance. As the class continued, Mrs. Langston's focus on Jada seemed to sharpen. Whenever Jada raised her hand, the teacher ignored her. When other students made similar points, they were met with approval. The pattern was clear. "Class," Mrs. Langston announced toward the end of the period, "you'll be working on a group project analyzing the themes of To Kill a Mockingbird. I'll be assigning the groups. Her tone carried a subtle implication. Jada knew this wouldn't end well for her. As names were called, Jada was grouped with 3 students known for their lackadaisical approach to schoolwork. None of them seemed thrilled to work with her. "Let's make sure everyone contributes," Mrs. Langston said, her gaze locking on Jada. "No free rides." Jada held her head high, her voice calm as she responded, "Of course." When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Jada gathered her belongings deliberately. She was almost out the door when Mrs. Langston's voice called her back. "Miss Anderson, a word." Jada turned, her expression neutral. "Yes, Mom." Mrs. Langston folded her arms, her posture stiff. "I've seen students like you before. Bright, but too focused on their personal agendas to succeed in a structured environment like this." Jada's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "I'm here to learn, Mrs. Langston. That's my only agenda." Mrs. Langston's smile was tight and cold. "Let's hope so. Otherwise, you'll find it hard to keep up." A fateful evening. That evening, Jada sat at the dinner table with her father, Principal Terrence Anderson. He was a tall, composed man with a commanding presence, his every word thoughtful and deliberate. "How was your first day?" he asked, his tone warm. Jada hesitated, debating whether to tell him about Mrs. Langston. She had always admired her father's professionalism and fairness, and she didn't want to seem like she was asking for special treatment. "It was fine," she said finally. "The class is challenging." Principal Anderson nodded, sensing her reluctance but deciding not to press. "Let me know if you need anything," he said, his voice steady but kind. Jada nodded, but as she cleared the table, her mind raced. She knew she couldn't ignore Mrs. Langston's treatment, but she also wanted to handle it on her own terms. She resolved to let her actions speak louder than words. A brewing storm. The next day, the tension between Jada and Mrs. Langston continued to build. When Jada excelled in her group project preparation, offering detailed insights and organizing her peers, Mrs. Langston found ways to dismiss her efforts. "That's an interesting take," she would say, her tone flat, "but not quite what I'm looking for." Still, Jada refused to be deterred. Each slight only strengthened her resolve. She knew she was playing a long game, and she was determined to win. What Jada didn't know was that Mrs. Langston's actions were not going unnoticed. Her classmates, once indifferent, began to sense the injustice. A quiet ripple of support began to grow, a force Mrs. Langston wouldn't see coming. The mask begins to slip. The sun streamed through the windows of room 314, casting long beams of light that seemed to cut through the thick tension hanging in the air. Jada walked in with her head held high, her backpack snug over her shoulder. As she approached her desk, a few classmates gave her small, supportive nods. Though subtle, these gestures were a marked shift from the silent indifference of the day before. Mrs. Langston stood at the front of the room, her sharp gaze darting over the students as they settled in. Her usual stern demeanor seemed more pronounced today, her body language taut with unspoken irritation. The class could sense it, an almost palpable animosity radiating from their teacher. It was no secret who her ire was directed toward. "Settle down," Mrs. Langston barked, her voice cutting through the low hum of chatter. The students fell silent as she picked up a thick textbook from her desk. "Today, we'll continue discussing To Kill a Mockingbird, but first, a quick recap. Miss Anderson." Jada looked up, meeting Mrs. Langston's icy stare. She could feel the weight of the teacher's challenge, but she remained composed. "Yes, Mom. Why don't you enlighten us?" "In one sentence, explain the central theme of the novel," Mrs. Langston said, her tone dripping with condescension. Jada took a deep breath, her hands resting calmly on her desk. "The novel demonstrates the destructive nature of prejudice and the courage required to challenge it." There was a beat of silence before Mrs. Langston's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "An expected answer," she said, turning toward the board. "But perhaps too simplistic." The themes are far more nuanced than just prejudice. For instance, has it occurred to you that the book's true message might focus more on personal morality than societal injustice? Jada raised her hand, her voice firm as she spoke. Respectfully, I believe the two are interconnected. The personal morality of characters like Atticus Finch is defined by how they confront societal injustice. Ignoring one undermines the other. Mrs. Langston froze mid-step, her hand tightening around the marker in her grip. A ripple of murmurs passed through the classroom, some students nodding in agreement with Jada's argument. Others exchanged nervous glances, sensing the brewing storm. That's quite enough, Mrs. Langston snapped, her voice sharp. Class discussions are about building understanding, not promoting one's personal agenda. A subtle rebellion. As the lesson progressed, Mrs. Langston found ways to undermine Jada at every turn. Whenever Jada contributed to the discussion, the teacher would cut her off, dismiss her points, or redirect the conversation towards someone else. The other students, once content to sit in passive silence, began to notice the pattern. During a group activity, Jada's team was tasked with analyzing a pivotal courtroom scene in the novel. She offered to take the lead, her ideas clear and organized. Her classmates were impressed by her insights and eagerly agreed to follow her guidance. But when Mrs. Langston walked over to check their progress, her criticism was swift and pointed. "This analysis is shallow," she said, her eyes narrowing as she scanned their notes. "Miss Anderson, it's your responsibility to elevate the discussion. I expected more." Jada's group mates exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier enthusiasm dampened. Jada, however, refused to let Mrs. Langston's words shake her confidence. "We'll adjust as needed," Jada said evenly. "Thank you for the feedback." Her calm response seemed to unsettle Mrs. Langston, who lingered for a moment before walking away. The turning point. That afternoon during lunch, Jada sat alone under a tree in the courtyard, reviewing her notes. A shadow fell over her notebook, and she looked up to see Sarah, one of her quieter classmates, standing there with a hesitant smile. "Hey," Sarah said, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "Mind if I sit with you?" Jada nodded, gesturing to the spot beside her. "Sure." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah fiddled with the strap of her bag, her gaze darting around the courtyard. Finally, she broke the silence. "I wanted to say, I think what's happening in class isn't fair," Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way Mrs. Langston talks to you, it's wrong." Jada's pen paused mid-sentence, and she turned to look at Sarah, her expression softening. "Thank you for saying that." Sarah hesitated, then continued. "A lot of us see it, but we don't know what to do. Mrs. Langston has been teaching here forever. She's practically untouchable." Jada's gaze grew thoughtful. Nobody's untouchable when they're doing something wrong, but it takes people standing together to make a change. Sarah nodded, her confidence growing. "You're right. Maybe we can start by speaking up when she's unfair." A spark of hope flickered in Jada's chest. "That would mean a lot," she said. "Thank you." A test of resolve. The following week, the class was scheduled to present their group projects. Jada had spent hours preparing, determined to make her team's presentation not just insightful but impactful. Her group mates had rallied behind her, impressed by her dedication and leadership. When it was their turn to present, Jada stepped to the front of the room with her team, her posture confident and her voice steady. They spoke about the symbolism of the mockingbird, connecting it to the broader themes of racial injustice and the loss of innocence. Jada's portion of the presentation was particularly compelling, drawing on real-world examples to emphasize the novel's relevance today. The class listened intently, many nodding along as she spoke. Even those who had been indifferent before seemed captivated by her words. But Mrs. Langston's expression grew darker with each passing moment. When the presentation ended and the class broke into applause, she stepped forward, her smile tight and unkind. "An interesting attempt," she said, her tone cold. "But I'm afraid you missed the mark. Your analysis was far too focused on race, overshadowing the novel's deeper themes of morality and personal integrity." The room fell silent. Jada's jaw tightened, but she refused to back down. "With respect, Mrs. Langston," she said, her voice steady, "I believe the racial themes are central to the novel's exploration of morality. Ignoring them diminishes the story's impact." Mrs. Langston's eyes narrowed. "Your inability to accept constructive criticism, Miss Anderson, is precisely why your academic performance continues to fall short." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Jada's classmates exchanged shocked and uncomfortable glances, the injustice of the situation now glaringly obvious. The seeds of change. That evening, Jada sat in her room, staring at her open laptop. She had drafted an email to her father, detailing everything that had happened in Mrs. Langston's class. Her finger hovered over the send button. She hesitated, her thoughts racing. Speaking up would bring attention to the problem, but it might also make her a target. Was she ready for that? Taking a deep breath, she hit send. If she didn't stand up now, she knew the situation would only worsen, not just for her, but for any other students who might face the same treatment. An unexpected ally. The next morning, Jada entered the classroom to find an unusual sight. Principal Anderson stood at the front of the room, his expression calm but serious. Mrs. Langston stood beside him, her posture stiff and her face unreadable. "Good morning, class," Principal Anderson said, his deep voice commanding the room's attention. "Today, I'll be sitting in on your lesson. It's important to me that our school fosters an environment of fairness and respect, and I want to ensure that every student feels valued." Jada's heart raced as her father's gaze briefly met hers. She saw in his eyes a quiet reassurance that this was just the beginning. Mrs. Langston, on the other hand, looked as though she'd swallowed a lemon. As the lesson began, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Mrs. Langston was careful with her words, her usual sharpness dulled by Principal Anderson's presence. The students, emboldened by his support, participated more freely, their voices carrying a new sense of confidence. For the first time, Jada felt truly seen, not just by her classmates, but by the institution itself. Exposing the truth. The classroom was unusually quiet as Principal Anderson took a seat at the back of room 314. His presence, calm yet authoritative, seemed to overshadow everything else in the room. The students were on edge, whispering to each other, stealing glances at him, then quickly looking away when his steady gaze swept the room. Mrs. Langston, standing rigidly at the front, exuded an air of forced calm, though the slight tremor in her hand as she adjusted her glasses betrayed her nerves. "Let's begin," Mrs. Langston announced, her voice tight. She flipped through the pages of her lesson planner before glancing at the students. "Today, we'll be focusing on the trial scene in To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a pivotal moment in the book, and I expect each of you to engage critically with the material." Her eyes briefly flicked to Jada, a subtle challenge laced within the glance. Jada, sitting near the middle of the room, met her gaze with quiet defiance, her posture upright, and her expression neutral. If Mrs. Langston expected her to cower or falter today, she was sorely mistaken. A question of integrity. Mrs. Langston began the discussion by summarizing the trial scene. Her words were precise and measured, but her delivery lacked the usual forcefulness. It was as if she were overly aware of Principal Anderson's watchful presence. To start, Mrs. Langston said, her eyes scanning the room, "What is the significance of Atticus Finch's defense of Tom Robinson? How does it relate to the broader themes of justice and morality in the novel?" Miss Anderson, care to answer? There was a subtle shift in the room. Some students tensed, their eyes darting between Jada and Mrs. Langston. Others, emboldened by the principal's presence, leaned forward slightly, curious to see what would happen next. Jada nodded, her voice clear and steady. Atticus's defense of Tom Robinson represents a moral stand against systemic injustice. By taking on the case, despite knowing the odds are against him, He demonstrates the importance of doing what's right, even when it's difficult. Mrs. Langston murmured, her lips pursing. An interesting interpretation. However, I would argue that Atticus's actions are less about systemic issues and more about personal ethics. He takes the case because he feels it's his duty as a lawyer, not because he's trying to change the system. Jada didn't flinch. Respectfully, I disagree. Atticus's actions are personal, yes, but they're also deeply political. His defense of Tom Robinson challenges the status quo in Maycomb, forcing the community to confront its prejudices. That's why his stance is so significant. It's both personal and systemic. A faint ripple of murmurs ran through the classroom. A few students nodded in agreement, while others exchanged nervous glances, anticipating Mrs. Langston's response. Her smile was thin and brittle. That's quite an ambitious reading, Miss Anderson. However, I think you might be overreaching. It's important not to project modern sensibilities onto historical texts. Principal Anderson's voice cut through the tension, calm but firm. And yet, Mrs. Langston, isn't it the purpose of literature to provoke critical thought and connect historical contexts to contemporary issues? By dismissing Jada's perspective, aren't we limiting the depth of the discussion? The room went silent. Mrs. Langston's hand froze mid-gesture, her eyes widening ever so slightly. For a moment, it looked as though she might argue, but she quickly adjusted her tone. "Of course, Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice forcedly polite. "Critical thinking is essential. I simply wanted to ensure the discussion remains grounded in the text." The shift in the room. As the class progressed, something began to change. The students, encouraged by Principal Anderson's presence, grew more vocal in their participation. They asked questions, challenged ideas, and offered insights without fear of rebuke. One student, Sarah, raised her hand tentatively. "Mrs. Langston, don't you think it's important to consider how the book's themes are still relevant today? Like the way racial bias influences the justice system now?" Mrs. Langston hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "That's an interesting point, Sarah, but let's not stray too far from the historical context of the novel." Jada raised her hand. "But isn't that the point of studying literature? To draw parallels between the past and the present? Otherwise, how do we learn from history?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Principal Anderson leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding. Mrs. Langston faltered, her mask of professionalism slipping for a brief moment. "I suppose," she said stiffly, "there is some value in exploring those connections, though I maintain that we must prioritize the author's intent." Behind closed doors, after class, Principal Anderson asked Mrs. Langston to meet with him in his office. The students watched them leave, their curiosity palpable. Jada remained seated, her heart pounding. She had no doubt about what the meeting was about. Inside the principal's office, Mrs. Langston sat across from Principal Anderson, her posture rigid. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. "Mrs. Langston," Principal Anderson began, his voice calm but firm, "I've been observing your class closely, and I have some serious concerns." Mrs. Langston shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Anderson, I assure you, my teaching methods are entirely professional. If there's been a misunderstanding—" "This isn't about a misunderstanding," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "It's about a pattern of behavior. Your dismissive attitude toward certain students, particularly Jada Anderson, is not only unprofessional but unacceptable." Mrs. Langston's face flushed. "I treat all my students equally." "Do you?" Principal Anderson asked, his gaze piercing. "Because what I witnessed today, and what I've heard from multiple sources, paints a very different picture." Mrs. Langston opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. "This isn't just about one student," Principal Anderson continued. "It's about creating a safe, inclusive environment where every student feels valued. Your behavior undermines that goal." A revelation. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside, Jada was approached by Sarah, and a few other classmates. They looked nervous but determined. "Jada," Sarah said, her voice low, "we've been talking, and we want to support you. The way Mrs. Langston treats you, it's not okay." Jada blinked, surprised. "Thank you. That means a lot. We were thinking." Another student chimed in, "Maybe we could write a letter to the administration. You know, about what's been happening in class." Jada hesitated, her emotions warring between gratitude and apprehension. She had been fighting this battle alone for so long that the idea of others standing with her felt almost foreign. "That could make a difference," she said finally. "But it's not just about me. If we're going to do this, we need to talk about the bigger picture, how everyone deserves to feel safe and respected here." The group nodded, their resolve growing stronger. The letter. That evening, Jada and her classmates worked together to draft the letter. They outlined specific incidents, detailed their concerns, and emphasized the need for change. By the time they finished, the letter was a powerful testament to their shared commitment to justice and equality. The next morning, they submitted it to Principal Anderson, who read it carefully. His expression shifted from stern to thoughtful as he finished. "This is an important step," he said, looking up at them. "I'm proud of you all for speaking up. Rest assured, this will be addressed." The consequences. Later that week, Mrs. Langston was called into another meeting, this time with the school board. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Student testimonies, observations from Principal Anderson, and even her own behavior in class. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that her position was untenable. She was placed on administrative leave pending further review. When the news broke, the school was abuzz. Some students were shocked. Others felt vindicated. For Jada, it was a bittersweet victory. While she was relieved that justice had been served, she knew the fight against prejudice was far from over. A new beginning. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in room 314 shifted dramatically. The class, now led by a substitute teacher, became a space for open dialogue and mutual respect. Students who had once been hesitant to speak up found their voices, and Jada, no longer silenced, became a leader among her peers. Principal Anderson, true to his word, introduced new initiatives to promote diversity and inclusion across the school. Workshops, guest speakers, and student-led discussions became a regular part of the curriculum. Jada watched these changes with a quiet sense of pride. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had helped spark a movement. But she also knew this was just the beginning. There was still work to be done, and she was ready to keep fighting. For herself, for her classmates, and for every student who had ever been made to feel less than they were. The cost of courage. The news of Mrs. Langston's administrative leave spread quickly throughout the school. For some, it was a shocking revelation that their once revered teacher could harbor such biases. For others, particularly students of color, it was a validation of experiences they had kept silent about for years. The hallways buzzed with conversations, whispers, and debates about what had happened and what it meant for the school's future. Jada Anderson, however, felt the weight of the situation acutely. While many of her peers commended her bravery, not everyone was supportive. The backlash came quietly at first, a muttered comment here, a pointed look there, but it didn't take long for the whispers to grow louder. Whispers and shadows. "Can you believe she got Mrs. Langston suspended?" One student whispered loudly to another as Jada walked past them in the hallway. "Yeah, it's not like Mrs. Langston was wrong. Jada was always trying to make everything about race," the other replied, their voice dripping with disdain. Jada kept her head high, refusing to let the words pierce the armor she had built. She had faced worse, and she knew her fight was bigger than the opinions of a few students. Still, the sting of their words lingered, a reminder of how deep-rooted prejudice could be. It wasn't just the students. Some parents, upset by Mrs. Langston's suspension, began calling the school to voice their disapproval. What's next? One parent reportedly demanded during a heated PTA meeting. Are we just going to punish every teacher who challenges a student? Principal Anderson, steadfast in his commitment to justice, stood firm against the backlash. This isn't about punishing a teacher, he said during the meeting. This is about ensuring that every student feels safe and valued in our classrooms. An unexpected ally. One afternoon, Jada was sitting alone in the library, her notebook open in front of her, when a familiar figure approached. It was Sarah, the quiet girl who had first spoken up in support of her during Mrs. Langston's class. "Hey," Sarah said, sliding into the chair across from her. "Mind if I join you?" Jada smiled faintly. Not at all. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence. Then Sarah leaned forward, her expression earnest. "I wanted to say, I know this hasn't been easy for you, and I also know that not everyone is treating you fairly right now." Jada's eyes softened. "Thank you. It's been a lot." Sarah hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking, maybe we can do something more, to address what's happening, not just with Mrs. Langston, but the bigger picture." "What do you mean?" Jada asked, intrigued. "Well," Sarah said, lowering her voice, "some of us have been talking. We want to start a club, a place where students can talk about these issues, share their experiences, and work toward change." Jada blinked, surprised. "You really want to do that?" Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "Yeah. And we want you to lead it." The beginning of change. The idea of a student-led group took shape quickly. Sarah, Jada, and a handful of other students began meeting after school to plan. They decided to call the club Voices for Change, a name that reflected their goal of amplifying marginalized voices and fostering understanding within the school community. Their first meeting was held in the library, and to Jada's surprise, over 20 students showed up. Some were there out of curiosity, others because they had their own stories to share. Jada stood at the front of the room, her palms slightly sweaty as she addressed the group. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steadied despite her nerves. "This club isn't just about what happened with Mrs. Langston. It's about creating a space where we can talk openly about the issues that affect us and work together to make our school a better place." As the meeting progressed, students began opening up. A sophomore named Miguel shared how he had often felt overlooked in advanced classes because of his accent. A junior named Aisha talked about the microaggressions she faced as one of the few black students in her honors classes. Even Sarah shared her own experiences, admitting that she had often stayed silent in the face of injustice because she didn't know how to help. By the end of the meeting, there was a palpable sense of solidarity in the room. For the first time, many of the students felt heard, understood, and empowered. The system strikes back. While the formation of Voices for Change was a triumph, it also drew criticism. Some parents accused the group of being divisive, arguing that it was unnecessary and political. One parent even went so far as to write an op-ed in the local newspaper, decrying the club as a dangerous influence that promotes victimhood. Jada read the article that evening, her stomach churning with anger and frustration. She felt the familiar sting of being misunderstood, her intentions twisted into something ugly. But when she looked at the growing list of members in Voices for Change, she reminded herself that the fight was worth it. The school administration, led by Principal Anderson, supported the club wholeheartedly. They provided a dedicated space for their meetings and even encouraged teachers to participate in discussions about fostering inclusivity in their classrooms. However, not all staff members were on board. Some, still loyal to Mrs. Langston, voiced their displeasure in hushed tones. Confrontation. One afternoon, as Jada was walking to her next class, she was stopped by one of the teachers, Mr. Grayson, who had been at the school nearly as long as Mrs. Langston. He was known for his gruff demeanor and traditionalist views. "Miss Anderson," he called, his tone sharp. Jada turned to face him, her chin lifting slightly. "Yes, Mr. Grayson." "I hope you're proud of yourself," he said, his voice low but cutting. "You've stirred up quite the mess. Do you really think disrupting the school is the best way to make your point? Jada took a deep breath, steadying herself. With all due respect, Mr. Grayson, I didn't disrupt anything. I stood up for what was right. If that makes some people uncomfortable, then maybe it's a sign that things need to change. Mr. Grayson's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, another voice interrupted. She's right. Jada turned to see Sarah standing a few feet away, her arms crossed and her expression firm. Standing up to injustice isn't disruptive, it's necessary. Mr. Grayson's face reddened, but he said nothing more, walking away with a huff. Jada turned to Sarah, her lips curving into a grateful smile. Thanks, she said softly. Anytime, Sarah replied. A victory for unity. As weeks turned into months, Voices for Change grew from a small group into a movement within the school. They organized events, including a diversity day that celebrated the different cultures represented in the student body. They held workshops on topics like implicit bias and allyship, inviting both students and teachers to participate. Jada emerged as a natural leader, her voice steady and confident as she guided discussions and encouraged others to share their perspectives. The experience was transformative, not just for her, but for the entire school community. Even those who had initially been skeptical of the club began to see its value. Slowly but surely, the walls of prejudice and misunderstanding that had once divided the school began to crumble. A quiet moment. One evening, as Jada sat on the porch with her father, she reflected on everything that had happened. The backlash, the victories, the hard conversations. It had all been worth it. I'm proud of you, Principal Anderson said, his voice filled with quiet pride. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for something bigger. Jada smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. I learned from the best. Her father chuckled, pulling her into a side hug. The fight's not over, though, he reminded her. There's still work to be done. Jada nodded, her eyes shining with determination. I know, but we're making progress. As they sat together under the stars, Jada felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead might be long, but she was ready to keep walking it, step by step, day by day, fighting for a future where every voice could be heard. The battle beyond the classroom. As Voices for Change grew, so did the resistance it faced. Outside the walls of Lincoln Heights High, whispers became roars as debates spilled into the community. Parents' meetings, social media groups, and even local news outlets buzzed with polarized opinions. Supporters hailed the club as a groundbreaking effort to create inclusivity, while detractors dismissed it as unnecessary, divisive, and disruptive. Jada found herself in the eye of the storm. She had become a symbol, not just for her classmates, but for a larger fight that stretched far beyond her school. Though she was determined to press forward, the strain was undeniable. Late nights spent preparing for meetings, heated discussions with skeptical teachers, and the occasional pointed comment in the hallways all weighed heavily on her. But despite the challenges, Jada's resolve only grew stronger. The protest. One crisp morning, Jada arrived at school to find a small group of parents gathered outside the main entrance, holding signs that read, "Let teachers teach, and no politics in schools." A few students milled around, watching the scene with a mix of curiosity and unease. Jada's heart sank as she recognized some of the parents from the PTA. Their faces were stern, their voices loud as they chanted slogans accusing the school of bending to political correctness and indoctrinating students. As she walked past them, one of the parents, a woman with a sharp voice and an accusatory glare, stepped forward. "You're Jada Anderson, aren't you?" Jada stopped, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She kept her voice steady, despite the knot in her stomach. "Yes, I am." "You should be ashamed," the woman said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You've turned this school upside down with your so-called activism. Teachers like Mrs. Langston dedicated their lives to education, and you ruined her career." Jada felt the heat of anger rise in her chest, but she refused to let it show. I didn't ruin anything, she replied calmly. I stood up for what was right. Mrs. Langston's actions had consequences, just like anyone else's. The woman scoffed, her grip tightening on her sign. You're just a kid. What do you know about what's right? Before Jada could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. She knows plenty. Turning, Jada saw Sarah stepping up beside her, her expression fierce. And if you think standing out here and yelling at her is going to change anything, you're wrong. The woman bristled but said nothing further. Jada and Sarah exchanged a small nod before walking into the school together. A principal's stand. Inside the school, Principal Anderson was busy addressing the growing controversy. That afternoon, he held a press conference in the library, inviting local reporters, community members, and teachers to hear his stance. I understand that these changes have sparked strong emotions. Principal Anderson began, standing tall at the podium. But let me be clear, creating an inclusive environment is not a political agenda. It's a moral obligation. He paused, letting his words settle over the room. Education is about more than just textbooks and test scores. It's about teaching our students to think critically, to empathize with others, and to stand up for justice. Voices for Change embodies those values, and I am proud to support their work. The room buzzed with murmurs. A reporter raised her hand. Principal Anderson, how do you respond to those who say this movement is divisive? Change often feels divisive because it challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, he replied. But the discomfort is necessary if we're going to grow as a community. Ignoring the problem doesn't make it go away. It only perpetuates it. Jada watched from the back of the room, her heart swelling with pride. Her father's words resonated deeply, reaffirming her belief in the work they were doing. The anonymous threat. Later that week, as Jada was organizing materials for an upcoming Voices for Change event, she received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "Stay in your lane." Her heart pounded as she clicked it open. The message was brief but chilling. You're stirring up trouble where there doesn't need to be any. Keep this up, and you'll regret it. Jada's hands shook as she stared at the screen. Fear gripped her, but it quickly gave way to anger. She forwarded the email to her father, knowing he would take it seriously. By the time she got home that evening, Principal Anderson had already reported the threat to the school district and local authorities. He sat with her at the kitchen table, his face a mix of concern and determination. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Jada nodded, though her voice trembled slightly. "Yeah, I'm not going to let them scare me." Her father reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. "You're incredibly brave, Jada. But remember, you don't have to face this alone. You have a whole community behind you." Voices for Change takes the stage. The following week, Voices for Change hosted their first major event, an open forum for students, teachers, and parents to share their experiences and ideas for improving inclusivity in the school. The auditorium buzzed with nervous energy as attendees filed in, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Jada stood backstage with Sarah and the rest of the club's leadership team. Her heart raced as she peeked out at the growing crowd. She knew this was a pivotal moment, not just for the club, but for the entire school community. When it was time to begin, Jada stepped onto the stage, the spotlight bright and warm against her skin. She took a deep breath, letting the silence settle before speaking. "Good evening," she began, her voice strong. "Thank you all for being here tonight. This forum is about more than just talking. It's about listening, understanding, and finding ways to move forward together." She shared her own story briefly, then opened the floor to others. One by one, students, parents, and teachers came forward to share their perspectives. Some spoke of the challenges they faced, while others offered ideas for fostering unity and respect. As the night went on, something remarkable began to happen. Walls that had once seemed impenetrable began to crack. People who had been on opposite sides of the debate found common ground, realizing that their shared goal was the betterment of the school community. a growing legacy. By the time the forum ended, it was clear that Voices for Change had made an impact. Attendees left the auditorium with a renewed sense of purpose, many of them vowing to take what they had learned and apply it in their own lives. For Jada, the night was a turning point. She realized that while the road ahead would still be challenging, the seeds of change had been planted. And with each passing day, those seeds would grow stronger, fueled by the courage and resilience of a community coming together. The morning after. The next morning, as Jada walked through the school halls, she noticed a subtle but significant shift. Students who had once ignored her now offered friendly smiles and nods. Teachers who had been skeptical of the club approached her with words of encouragement. Even some of the parents who had protested outside the school began to soften their stance, acknowledging the importance of the conversations that Voices for Change had sparked. Jada knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of hope that the fight for justice and equality was not in vain. As she entered her English classroom, now led by a new teacher who embraced open dialogue and diverse perspectives, Jada felt a surge of pride. The classroom, once a battleground, had become a place of learning and growth. She took her seat, her heart steady and her mind focused. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. A ripple becomes a wave. Months passed, and the transformation at Lincoln Heights High became impossible to ignore. What began as a small group of determined students speaking out against injustice had blossomed into a school-wide movement. Voices for Change continued to grow, its impact extending far beyond the walls of the school. The discussions it sparked rippled outward, influencing the broader community and even garnering attention from neighboring schools. For Jada Anderson, life had settled into a new rhythm. Though she still encountered resistance from some corners, the outpouring of support she received made the challenges worthwhile. She had become a symbol of resilience and courage, not just for her peers but for the community at large. An invitation. One chilly morning, as Jada walked to her locker, she was stopped by Principal Anderson. His expression was a mix of pride and excitement as he handed her an envelope with the school's official seal. "What's this?" Jada asked, her brow furrowing as she tore it open. "It's an invitation," her father replied with a smile. "The school district has asked you to speak at their upcoming education summit. They want to hear about Voices for Change and the work you've been doing." Jada's eyes widened as she read the letter. The summit was a major event, attended by educators, administrators, and students from across the state. The thought of standing on such a large stage was both thrilling and nerve-wracking. I don't know," she said hesitantly. "What if I mess up?" "You won't," her father said firmly. "You've been leading this movement from the start. This is your chance to inspire even more people." Jada took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "Okay," she said. "I'll do it." Preparing for the summit. In the weeks leading up to the summit, Jada threw herself into preparation. She worked with Sarah and the Voices for Change team to craft her speech, drawing from their shared experiences and the impact they had made. Every word mattered, and Jada wanted to ensure that her message was clear. Real change was possible, but it required courage, collaboration, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The night before the summit, Jada sat at her desk, reading over her speech for the 100th time. Her father knocked on her door and stepped inside, his expression warm. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Nervous," Jada admitted. "What if I forget my words, or freeze up?" Principal Anderson chuckled softly. "You've faced far bigger challenges than this, Jada. Just speak from the heart, and you'll be fine." She nodded, his encouragement giving her a much-needed boost of confidence. The summit. The auditorium buzzed with energy as attendees filed in, their voices blending into a low hum. Jada stood backstage, peeking through the curtain as she tried to steady her breathing. The room was enormous, filled with hundreds of people, students, teachers, and administrators from across the state. When her name was announced, a wave of applause erupted. Jada stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding as she approached the podium. The bright lights felt overwhelming for a moment. But as she looked out at the crowd, she spotted familiar faces. Her father, Sarah, and other members of Voices for Change, all smiling up at her. She took a deep breath, and then she began. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady. "My name is Jada Anderson, and I'm here to talk about something that has transformed my school and my life." She spoke about the events that led to the formation of Voices for Change, the challenges they had faced, and the progress they had made. She shared stories of students who had found their voices through the club, of teachers who had embraced new ways of thinking, and of a community that had come together despite its differences. "This isn't just about one school or one teacher," Jada said, her voice growing stronger. "It's about creating spaces where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. It's about understanding that diversity isn't a problem to be solved. It's a strength to be celebrated." As she finished her speech, the auditorium erupted into applause. Jada stepped back from the podium, her heart swelling with pride. She had done it, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt silenced or marginalized. A new chapter. The summit marked the beginning of a new chapter for Voices for Change. Inspired by Jada's speech, other schools began reaching out, asking for advice on how to start similar initiatives. Jada and her team found themselves leading workshops, hosting virtual forums, and collaborating with educators to promote inclusivity in classrooms across the state. Back at Lincoln Heights High, the culture continued to evolve. Diversity and inclusion became central to the school's mission, with new policies, programs, and training sessions ensuring that every student had the opportunity to thrive. Even the staff underwent significant changes. Teachers who had once resisted the movement began to embrace it, attending workshops and rethinking their approaches to education. The school's leadership team worked tirelessly to ensure that Mrs. Langston's mistakes would not be repeated. For Jada, the journey had been transformative. She had started as a quiet student determined to stand up for herself, but she had become a leader, a changemaker, and a voice for those who had long been unheard. Reflection. One afternoon, Jada sat under the same tree in the courtyard where she had first spoken to Sarah. She was joined by her father, who had taken a rare break from his duties as principal to spend time with her. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Do you realize how many lives you've touched?" Jada smiled, looking out at the bustling courtyard. "I think I do. But it's not just me. None of this would have happened without the people who stood with me." Her father nodded. "That's true. Change is never a solo effort, but it takes someone brave enough to spark it. And that was you." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Jada spoke again. "Do you think things will really change?" she asked, her tone thoughtful. "Not just here, but everywhere." Her father considered the question carefully. "Change is a journey, not a destination," he said. "There will always be challenges, setbacks, and resistance. But as long as there are people like you, people willing to stand up and speak out, progress is inevitable." Jada nodded, his words filling her with a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she was ready for it. The legacy of Voices for Change. Years later, long after Jada had graduated, Lincoln Heights High continued to thrive as a model of inclusivity and equity. The principles of Voices for Change had become deeply ingrained in the school's culture, inspiring new generations of students to carry the torch forward. Jada, now a college student pursuing a degree in social justice and education, often reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had faced fear, doubt, and resistance, but she had also found strength, hope, and community. And in her heart, she knew that the ripple she had started at Lincoln Heights High would continue to grow, touching countless lives and creating a world where every voice could be heard.